over the last 10 years, there were 106 nonprofit four-year institutions that closed. And that's more than there were in the previous 2 decades combined. So I think we'll be above historical levels, but I don't see a wipeout situation like some are predicting, because these colleges, depending on who you talk to, they're stubborn or they're resilient.
Welcome to Small College America, a podcast dedicated to the exploring the role and the value of small colleges in the higher education landscape. I'm Dean Hoke, and I'm joined by my co-host, Kent Barnes.
Thanks, Dean. Today, we are joined by a guy who is everywhere in the higher ed media. And I must admit, I'm a fanboy. Robert Kelchen is a professor of higher education and head of the Department of Educational Leadership and Policy Studies at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. His research interests include education finance, accountability policies, and student financial aid. He is the author of Higher Education Accountability and regularly publishes in top education journals. He's received the Robert P. Huff Golden Quill Award for excellence in financial aid research from the National Association of Student Financial Aid Administrators and has been recognized as one of the most influential faculty members in Education by Education Week. Robert is also the data editor for the Washington Monthly Magazine's annual college guide and rankings. He holds a bachelor's degree in economics and finance from Truman State University, a master's degree in economics from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and a PhD in educational policy studies from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Robert, welcome. We're really glad to have you. I'm going to turn it over to Dean to get us kicked off.
All right.
Well, Robert, thanks for being on the show. And we have no lack of things to talk about, particularly that's what's been going on during the past months. But I think I would like to begin a little bit before we get into the data. I'd like you to briefly describe your work at the University of Tennessee, what you teach, research, and how the role shapes the way you think, particularly about institutional financial risk, and keeping in mind that many of our people that listen to this show are from the small college world. So why don't you go ahead?
Sure. And the reason I'm at the University of Tennessee is actually not really my research and teaching. It's because I'm a department head, and that's why they hired me. With that being said, my research is a lot about the finances of colleges and universities. And when I teach, it's typically a seminar on higher education finance, where I get a cohort of PhD students who generally don't have a lot of experience with finance and teach them the basics of it. And in doing that, I get to go through case studies, financial statements in my teaching. And then for research, I spend a lot of time looking at the finances of small colleges. And I get a lot of calls from reporters saying, I hear this institution struggling. Can you walk me through a financial statement? And then every once in a while, I get a nice one from a reporter saying, this one looks like a success story. Can we pull it apart?
Very good. And with that in mind, what was the attraction? What interested you, particularly in this particular area of education?
Yeah, it's really just a long time fascination with where the money comes from and where it goes. And then also just knowing that, I mean, these colleges are anchoring institutions of their communities and their regions, and just trying to understand, can they make it? If so, how? And if not, what do we do?
Got it. Ken?
I'm curious, before I ask the second question, because you spend so much time talking to reporters and they oftentimes come to you to kind of test viability, what do you find? Are they asking the right questions? And I would ask the same of your PhD students. Or is it really starting at square one when it comes to trying to explain higher ed and college finance?
It is fairly close to square one, where say a reporter may hear an accreditor took action against an institution, or they've heard concerns about it and they want to know if it's real or not.
Interesting. Yeah, would have imagined that probably was the case. Or on campus, somebody's heard, oh, the discount rate is high. They usually don't know what the discount rate is, but they feel like that's something that's dangerous. So that's kind of what you hear and then respond. So we're grateful to have you doing that and responding on behalf of higher ed. Robert, you recently evaluated the newest IPEDS finance data and dug into how often colleges lose money across sectors You pointed out that the frequency of institutional financial losses is rising, especially among private nonprofit colleges. What does this trend tell you about the resilience or perhaps lack of resilience of small colleges? And how should leaders interpret an episodic loss versus persistent operating losses? What does your research tell you?
First of all, episodic losses are quite common just because they're driven by good or bad years in the stock market. That if you have a bad year, there's a good chance you'll be listed as losing money, but it doesn't mean that the sky is falling. But if you take out investment gain or loss and you're losing money, that is a serious concern. And we have seen the share of private nonprofits losing money tick up over the last decade, even in good years. For example, fiscal 2024 was a pretty good year for investments, but at the same time, still 30% of private nonprofit colleges lost money.
And with that in mind, can you explain to me, I mean, that contradiction in terms? I mean, what are you observing out of that? While the market's rising and things are going, they're losing more money. That's confusing to me.
That really means that these colleges are facing some substantial financial headwinds. And there are several really important ones to note. First is private nonprofit colleges are disproportionately in the Northeast and Midwest. Those are the areas that are disproportionately seeing that drop in traditional age students. We're seeing operating costs rising quickly. Even if you're not giving much in the way of pay raises, health insurance and maintenance insurance, those are all factors that are rising pretty quickly. And then also getting into the last 12 months, there's just been an incredible amount of uncertainty about basically every revenue source given the action, inaction, reaction coming out of Washington, D.C.
Yeah, it has been a bit confusing, I would think. Well, let's kind of keep going down this area a little bit about financial stress. In your work on financial stress indicators like operating losses and enrollment declines and changes in endowment and state support, what combination of metrics should small college leaders watch most closely in terms of the warning signs? If you're sitting there and you're a president, I mean, and you're talking to your CFO, what do you want to know? What's those warning signs? What should really prick up my ears?
The two biggest ones, consistent operating losses, and then having to pull sizable amounts out of the endowment. Enrollment is nice in the sense that it can give you a near real-time sense of where you might be, but the challenge then becomes tuition discount rates, where some of these colleges are discounting so heavily that enrollment is rising at the same time that net tuition revenue is falling. And there are lots of other fancy metrics that you could use, but for most colleges, operating losses and endowment get you there. And if you are really struggling financially, then it is all about cash on hand. It doesn't help if you have assets, if they're, say, tied up in buildings and you can't get anyone to issue credit anymore.
So, as a president or as a CFO, I'm seeing these kind of numbers and I'm seeing what's been happening over the past year. I suppose one of the questions that comes to mind is about conveying that message, particularly to my bosses, which are the board of trustees, which I assume in many cases are all great business people, but I'm not sure how much they really know about colleges and college finances and how they work. In your experience so far, have you seen anything that how they may approach that situation in a sense that they're looking at the balance sheet one day? I mean, do you call it a immediate meeting? I mean, I'd be curious from your perspective how that chain of command works and what they should be telling each other.
We're starting to see a shift in both institutional leadership and in boards to take financial concerns more seriously. The stereotypical private college board has been fairly wealthy, older alumni who kind of trust the institution to go down the right path, haven't really asked those tough questions. And now we're in a landscape where they have to be asking tough questions, and even more painfully, they may have to suggest or approve a different path forward for the institution because what worked when the alumni were on campus in 1985 no longer works in 2026. I think sometimes boards and presidents get too focused on enrollment numbers when, again, enrollment is not necessarily the best measure of financial health.
Okay.
In addition to your research and your focus on economic viability and the business model, you're also the data editor for Washington Monthly's college rankings. And they're a little bit different in that they place some emphasis on outcomes and public value. I'm curious to know, because I think this is especially of interest to our listeners, which again are primarily at smaller private colleges. How does the lens change when you change the way you think about financial aid or financial health and accountability and the pressures that small colleges face? When you think about that public outcome and what Washington Monthly emphasizes, how does that economic focus change?
There are colleges that are struggling financially and still find a way to do a good job on social mobility. The two don't have to be mutually exclusive. The challenge is, can some of these colleges have the resources they need to deliver good outcomes to students without charging them really high prices or trying to limit financial aid? But I think that the focus of a lot of institutions needs to be, we are doing work for the public good, we're doing work for our region, because many of these small private colleges, they're regionally focused institutions. They don't have national ambitions. They are serving their regions well. They are one of the anchors. And that means you have to serve students from that area really well.
Robert, this has been a theme throughout every season that the Dean and I have been working, is how important it is for small colleges to be deeply embedded and plugged in to their community and to be responsive to those needs. So I love the fact that you're emphasizing that, and that public outcome is important. In one episode, Dean and I talked about a place that closed, and it was a surprise to their community, and it left a huge gap in that community. And I think that emphasis on public good is so important and a great reminder for our audience at small colleges.
Yeah, and I worry a lot about the hole that closing a college leaves in that local community, because often there isn't someone ready to step in and buy the real estate and do something with it. And it may sit empty for years. Or you get a few cases where you get creative reuse, but then still you're down a major employer in the area.
I want to add a further comment to that, because I've been watching one school that Kent knows that I've known about for a long time. And when the school closed, of course, it hurt. It was a small town. But but there's also this concept of false hope that happens. And I'll give you an example. This school, after being closed and the campus being shuttered for about a year and a half, a quote unquote new investor showed up, not to reopen the school, but to take over the buildings and turn it into XYZ. And everybody in town jumped for joy. The only problem is they never had their financing in place, which, by the way, seems to be I have a feeling may be a very typical story that happens. Now the governor has literally stepped in and suggesting that the federal government might use it for a training base or something like that. It is one of the telltale signs, particularly for small towns, that happens. And quite frankly, I don't know, I'd want to be a mayor or city councilman trying to address that type of issue. You seen examples like that as well in terms of some of the data that you've been going through or what your stories have brought up?
There do seem to be quite a few false starts where someone comes in to buy. They may want to start an educational institution, but sometimes it's a foreign buyer who knows nothing about accreditation. Or there's this grand scheme, and then they realize deferred maintenance is $27 million. It's just, by the time some of these institutions close, there is so little left of value, which is sad, but it's also just the reality that it's hard to reuse the campus unless you're willing to basically knock it all down and start over. And it works in urban areas where we have college acquisitions for real estate, but in rural areas, that's extremely difficult.
That's a very good point. I'd like to go back a little bit into the world of trustees and, shall we say, their increasing involvement. I do think they're becoming more activist now because of everything that's been going on and what they read, the articles that you're quoted in and things like that. If you were a person, let's say you were asked to serve on a board of trustees of a small college in Tennessee. Okay. What questions would you be asking? And what do you think you need in terms of information and possibly even training?
If I was coming in assessing a college's situation, I'd be looking very closely at financial statements and balance sheets and then asking questions about cash on hand first. Those are just the level setting pieces. Then the questions turn really academic offerings because one challenge that a lot of small colleges have had is the way they've gotten enrollment is they're investing in programs like health sciences,
Okay.
which they'll get students, but those programs are incredibly expensive to operate. And meanwhile, you have other parts of your faculty that you're struggling to fully use, the parts that tend to be less expensive to run. So I'd be asking questions about just what has changed with students, where they're going, and asking what do we have the infrastructure to run? Because it's not unusual to have some parts of a campus bursting at the seams while others are really struggling.
Yeah. One of the other things that occurs to me, and you're talking about with the small colleges in smaller town communities, when I was asked to serve on a board of trustees many years ago, I was an alum, which was fine. And I think a lot of people come on the boards from that. I wonder what type of diversity, meaning geography, meaning the type of people that you should have on a board of trustees, where you have the ability as a president or senior people to influence that. Yeah, but you kind of have the ultimate mix. What would you want if you were a college president and I had a board of trustees, besides everybody having $1 billion?
I would want, one key thing is boards are likely to have a lot of alumni. I'd like a few people who are not alumni who just have an external perspective. Also, and this may cost you some in donations in the short term, but having some alumni who are younger as well as older. So you have people who have experienced campus in its more recent form, as well as people who fondly remember what it was like 40 years ago when enrollment was 50% higher. And then also thinking about, do you have diversity by field of study and major as well? Or are you disproportionately people who say we're business majors? And then are there any key areas where you're really looking for help and support? And you can have a board member potentially advise you on that, while also recognizing if you have too much of that, you run the risk of that board member capturing the entire conversation.
Mm.
But if you're a small, struggling college, you may be able to take that risk to get some good pro bono advice on how to do things.
So you might bring in also, in terms of in small town, what do you think the involvement is of people within the small town? Maybe not even necessarily graduates. I mean, how important are they to that mix, you think?
That's a really good idea that even if you don't have them on your governing board, having some kind of an advisory board from that local community, because any changes that you make really ripple through that community, and you can get support for what you're trying to do and make sure it's also generally aligned with where the community wants to go.
That's a great perspective. And I love that kind of the way that you've outlined it. The finances are important, but also that programmatic mix and what you can add value to. And then the way that you've described the diversity in the mix of the board, I think is extremely helpful. It's actually reminds me a little bit about the way people direct their philanthropic dollars. The old guard, they were just going to support dear old you no matter what. And younger donors are much more cause focused and cause oriented, and having that mix of ages and decades on a board, I think, is so important, especially with the philanthropy question. So appreciate you bringing that up. We love to challenge our guests to think a little bit about the future. And we won't hold your crystal ball responsible for your prediction. But given your area of scholarship and research and expertise, we'd invite you to think 5 years ahead, and we'd love to know what your thoughts are and your expectation for financially distressed small colleges. Is that going to stabilize? Is it going to accelerate? Have we sort of reached a peak? What's your sense, and what are you going to be looking for? The Higher Ed Dive, and about every month or so, they update the list of college closures across America. So what's your crystal ball telling you, Robert?
I would lean towards stabilize. And it's two factors I think that will largely cancel each other out. One factor is just the economic headwinds facing so many small colleges. But on the other hand, we have colleges that are getting a lot more serious about trying to cut costs. The old days of trying to grow your way out of financial problems are largely done. And now we're in a world where institutions are getting a little bit more thoughtful about making cuts. And I think because of that, the number of closures and the number of colleges in severe distress, I think, is going to flatten out some. And with that being said, over the last 10 years, there were 106 nonprofit four-year institutions that closed. And that's more than there were in the previous 2 decades combined. So I think we'll be above historical levels, but I don't see a wipeout situation like some are predicting, because these colleges, depending on who you talk to, they're stubborn or they're resilient. And then we also have faith-based institutions that, I mean, divine intervention is one of their strategies, or simply trying to outrun the institution located 20 miles down the road. But through all those factors, I think that this is a pretty resilient sector, and most of them are going to find a way to get through, even though it is going to be difficult to do so.
Can I ask one quick fight? I appreciate your focus and calling to attention that places are increasingly serious about cost cutting and that those efforts are going to be a part of this stabilization. Can you identify sort of the change in atmosphere that has led institutions to be more focused or more open to that serious cost cutting, which I think has been, that's been hard for higher ed, and that's been hard for small colleges and large colleges alike. Is there something that you would kind of pinpoint that has changed the atmosphere to that being a proper solution to this?
I think there are two drivers of that. One is all the conversation about the demographic cliff, which is at least somewhat overblown because it's a gradual decline, not this one-time big drop-off. But I think a lot of trustees think about it as, oh, we're going to drop 15% tomorrow. No, you're not. And then the second is the pandemic.
Yeah.
Even though fiscal year 2021, the pandemic year, ended up being great for institutional finances because the federal government stepped in a big way. But the first 2 months of the pandemic scared everyone working in the sector, and they became very concerned about taking on liabilities. And some of that has lived on now to where cost cutting, I think, is more acceptable now. And even if you're the one who has to go out and declare financial existence, even that is more acceptable now than it was 5 years ago.
Thanks for identifying those two factors.
Yeah.
That's really helpful. And I would agree that those are two things that have created an atmosphere where you can have those conversations that were much more difficult pre-pandemic.
I would like to get one last part of your future thinking. While you're saying that we may see more stabilization, do you see an increasing number of mergers or new partnership concepts happening? Do you see anything? Do you see an increase in that, or do you think? I'm kind of curious about your thoughts about that.
I think it's possible, but there are really only two cases where it makes sense. One is an institution is still relatively thriving when they enter into a partnership, which is not the way most presidents and boards think about it, because they're fiercely independent. The second is it's not really a college, it's a real estate transaction. And that's where some of the campuses located in urban areas will have no problem finding a partner. But for colleges in rural areas, that's going to be a much bigger problem.
True, I'm afraid. Well, Robert, I'm afraid we have run out of time, and I very much want to thank you for joining us today and giving your very thoughtful perspective on the challenges and opportunities facing small colleges, particularly at this pivotal moment in higher education. I want to commend you for your work. It's helping bring clarity to the conversations that can otherwise feel quite overwhelming, I think, for campus leaders and for people that have a vested interest in higher education. For those listening or viewing, if you'd like to learn more about Small College America, please do go to our website at smallcollegeamerica.net, where you can find details on upcoming episodes, contact us, or suggest topics you'd like us to cover. This episode of Small College America is made possible by underwriting support from Edge Alliance Group, a higher education consulting firm that champions small colleges and communities they serve. On behalf of our guest, Robert Kelchen, my co-host, Kent Barnes, and myself, thank you very much for joining us.